a few of my videos, we've discussed the fact that electoral parties, especially the two major parties in the US right now, are political machines built, staffed, and maintained by the ruling business owner class, and that their primary function is to implement policies that make the business owner class more money. While we have looked at evidence for that claim in this video, we never really went into detail about how those machines were made. Well, today we will. This is going to be the episode in a series where we view the development of the modern American political landscape through a dialectical lens. We'll be analyzing the material incentives that formed various political machines, as well as their interaction with their dialectical partner, and the material incentives that shaped that dialectical interaction. As you might have noticed, I will be using a lot of complicated sounding dialectical materialist terminology. If you're unfamiliar, I would highly recommend watching this video first, which goes into much more detail about the dialectical materialist worldview. You're going to be confused if you don't. Don't say I didn't warn you. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. Before we get into the meat of the analysis, I want to draw your attention to something. In my last video, you might have noticed that my analysis focused on a very narrow slice of the population. It only mentioned non-white people and poor white people as they related to the two tiny but impossibly wealthy and powerful ruling classes. Some might see that as an analysis that dismisses their roles in the construction of the society of the US, and in a sense they're right. Other than mentioning it as the preamble to the establishment of the US and the occasional G-side inflicted by US troops and citizens, my video hardly mentioned the indigenous people of the continent. Other than the political issues brought about by their ownership, it hardly mentioned people of African descent. Other than the political fallout of the conflict, it only briefly mentioned the Whiskey Rebellion by mostly poor whites. But importantly, this is not to say that these people and these events are unimportant, or even less important to the development of the US than the rich white male ruling classes. This is simply a limitation of the dialectical lens. You see, the dialectical materialist lens explicitly focuses on the two most influential classes at the time, not because it values them more than other classes, but because it's a matter of historical fact that, by definition, those classes are the ones who dictated the direction that society would eventually take. To zoom in on the interactions of these classes is, unfortunately, to exclude all the other classes, in the same way that to zoom in on a tsunami is to exclude all the other parts of the ocean, and in the same way that a tsunami is a small part of a vast ocean with impossibly complex internal interactions that also act on and influence the tsunami itself, the ruled classes of any given society are a vast ocean of impossibly complex internal interactions that also act on and influence the ruling classes. It's just that, given the benefit of hindsight, we can see that these ruling classes were the ones that played the decisive role at the time. After the tsunami passes, we can see that our house was destroyed by the tsunami, and not by the currents on the other side of the ocean. That said, we ended our analysis in the last video with the sublation of the Federalists into the Democratic-Republican synthesis. That is, the Northern Proto-Industrial class abandoned their previous party affiliation to enter the new Democratic-Republican Party, largely as a result of the fallout from the Napoleonic Wars and the War of 1812. This emerging Democratic-Republican Party had secured power by expanding its electoral base by conquering new lands, distributing those lands to free white men, and then giving those free white men the vote. Something not too dissimilar to the structure of capitalist imperialism, which I've already talked about in this video, because it was indeed a prototype of that system. In most histories of the US, this era was referred to as the Era of Good Feelings, and was centered on the presidency of James Monroe. Monroe was the Secretary of State and Secretary of War during the War of 1812, and was elected almost unanimously in 1816 on essentially the existing platform of the Democratic Republicans, namely, to continue their imperialism in the West and to stomp out the traitorous pro-British Federalists, while also quietly implementing their policies of nationalizing the economy and protecting US manufacturing with tariffs. Monroe also settled the aftermath of the War of 1812, signing several treaties with the British that put the two countries back in each other's good graces. As we saw in the last video, video, these seemingly contradictory policies served to consolidate both the slaveholding planter class of the South and the proto-industrialists of the North into one political party, a new synthesis. He did a great job of this, and was almost unanimously re-elected in 1820. That was, until the synthesis inevitably split. You see, at the time, a territory in the West by the name of Missouri was looking to join the Union, but there was an issue with it. Of course, that issue wasn't the conquest and ethnic cleansing of all the people that had lived there for tens of thousands of years. Why would that be a problem? It's not like they're white. The problem, rather, was the question of slavery in the new state. You see, the proto-industrialist class in the North, currently the target of rampant anti-federalist sentiment, and having already lost political control of the government thanks to the sublation of their policies into the platform of the Democratic Republicans, were looking to limit the power of their dialectical partner, the Southern planter class. A tactic for doing this had already been floating around in the minds of the proto-industrialist class for a while. It was, in fact, point number 3 of the Hartford Convention, which we discussed in the last video. You see, during the writing of the Constitution, it had become important to get exact counts of state population, because that determined the representation of that state in Congress. This doesn't sound like a particularly big ask, even in those days, but the sticking point was whether or not slaves should be counted as people. The Southern planters, ironically, wanted them to be counted as such, while the Northern proto-industrialists didn't. Not because the Northerners gave a shit about them either way, of course, but because counting slaves as people would give Southern states, all of whom were of course in the pocket of the Southern planter class, huge majorities in Congress. Both ruling classes went back and forth for a while, before eventually deciding to kick the can down the road and count slaves as 3/5 of a person for the purpose of allocating state representation. Well, in 1820, that can landed smack dab in the center of the road with Missouri's request to join the Union. If Missouri, a slave state, was allowed to join, that would upset the balance of free and slave states in Congress, handing even more power to Southern planters. Thanks to various abolitionist movements among normal people in the North, but probably more due to the fact that slavery was not profitable in northern climates, by this time all northern states had already abolished slavery, so the politicians in the pockets of the proto-industrialists in the North were able to use abolitionist rhetoric as a political tool to fight against the Southern planter class. This culminated in Northern Representative James Talmadge insisting that Missouri abolish slavery in order to join the Union. Thus, cracks in our Democratic-Republican synthesis had begun to form. Those in the pocket of the slaveholding Southern planters wanted Missouri in as a slave state, and those in the pocket of the Northern industrialists wanted Missouri in as a free state. Debate went back and forth for a while, but the real split was postponed when the northern part of Massachusetts decided it wanted to dip and become the new free state of Maine. Congress, looking to put all this awkwardness behind them and focus instead on massacring indigenous people, immediately seized on this and said that Missouri could come in as a slave state if Maine came in as a free state. Missouri had a much larger population though, so the Northerners demanded that, other than Missouri, slavery be prohibited north of the 3630 parallel going forward, which Southerners agreed to because most of that land was not great for slave plantation agriculture anyways. The can had thus been successfully kicked down the road once again. It didn't go quite as far this time though. Because the contradiction of slavery had not been addressed, tensions rose again just 4 years later in the presidential election of 1824 to replace President Monroe. This race was complicated by 4 separate candidates, but of those 4 candidates, only 3 of them really matter: John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, and Henry Clay. Now, in order to understand what happens next, we need to pause for a second and learn a bit about this Andrew Jackson fella. He originally made his money as a land surveyor out west, which at this point meant Tennessee. That is, by purchasing land recently acquired by the government and selling it with a significant upcharge to white settlers coming out west. This land was acquired by the government by ethnically cleansing, mass murdering, and expelling the indigenous people, something that I've no doubt you've noticed has been a recurring theme in US history. Jackson then reinvested this blood money into a slave plantation, moving him from the lowly position of racist land thief to the heights of Southern society, becoming a good old Southern planter. Though this trading of stolen land got him his fortune, it didn't get him his fame. He got that from his involvement in the War of 1812, when most of the indigenous people of the interior allied with the British to halt the relentless advance of the Americans into their territory. As soon as war broke out, Jackson volunteered and set to work acquiring some of that indigenous land. What brought him his first glimpse of fame was his command at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, when a US force, upwards of 3,000 strong, barged their way into a 1,000-man encampment of Creeks and slaughtered 8 in 10 of them, before flaying their corpses and fashioning their skins into souvenirs for the ladies of Tennessee. This battle resulted in the US government acquiring 23 million acres of creek land, presumably to then be purchased and resold by surveyors like Jackson. Jackson also fought the British in New Orleans and committed several other massacres of indigenous people. And by the end of the war, he was one of the most popular figures in US politics. That should give you an indication of how highly the average US citizen at the time thought about Native Americans. Acts of biblical violence conducted for the sake of white supremacy and the profit motive aside, Jackson was now in the perfect position to start a political movement. In 1824, though Jackson got the most popular votes, the election was eventually decided by Congress in favor of John Quincy Adams. Certainly, this will never again be an issue in US politics. Curiously, House Speaker and third presidential candidate Henry Clay was given a position as the Secretary of State in the Adams administration. And so Jackson, of course, accused Adams and Clay of a corrupt bargain. Those cracks in the Democratic-Republican synthesis were deepening. But the final break came when the Adams administration began to pursue explicitly economic nationalist and protectionist trade policies that heavily favored the northern proto-industrialists that backed him at the expense of the southern planters. Yes, the exact same kinds of policies the Federalists had advocated for, and the Democratic-Republican Party had originally been built to oppose. Now the southern planter class, pissed at the relentless attacks on their beloved institution of slavery, their loss in the 1824 election, and most of all, unfavorable trade policies, split from the Democratic Republicans, putting Jackson at the head of their new movement and working to build another political machine, while the remaining Democratic Republican Party collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. Thus was born the Democratic Party. Yes, that one. A party built by the southern planter class to combat the economic interests of the northern proto-industrialists. This didn't quite energize the common man, though, so they looked back to their last political project under Thomas Jefferson to get some more voters on board. They took two main strategies from Jefferson. First, they created so-called Jacksonian democracy, in explicit reference to the Jeffersonian democracy of the 1790s. This was an idealized form of the US as a society of small, white, male yeoman farmers, free from the interference of a large, centralized, corrupt central government. Exactly the same as Jefferson had advocated for. The other strategy borrowed from Jefferson was that of continued imperialism against the indigenous, ethnically cleansing and stealing ever more land from them, before surveyors, definitely not Jackson though, bought it and resold it to white men at an upcharge. Hand in hand with this imperial system went the expansion of the right to vote, to all white men. Those same free white men that the Democrats had just handed a bunch of cheap stolen land to. I bet you can guess who they voted for. And voila, Jackson was elected in 1828, and immediately him and his Democratic Party began to consolidate power and force their agenda through. A key part of this was what US historians like to refer to as the spoils system, but what everyone else on Earth would just call corruption. This was the precedent, started by Jackson, of newly elected presidents replacing all appointees from the previous administration with loyalists from their own party. These Democrats also created, passed, and implemented the Indian Removal Act, among others, initiating the largest and most explicit ethnic cleansing program in US history. Much of this cleansing was concentrated in the South, clearing the way for Democratic voting Southern planters to expand into some of the most fertile agricultural land on the continent. Some crumbs were also, of course, dropped down to poor white men to ensure that they kept voting blue, no matter who. On a completely unrelated note, these policies of Jackson's Democrats were some of the chief inspirations of the Austrian that gained control over Germany a century later. So, what were the northern proto-industrialists up to at this point? Defending the rights of the natives? Well, no, they didn't care in the slightest. After the collapse of the Democratic-Republican Party, Northerners dabbled in some proto-fascism with the anti-Masonic Party, but really there was no clear uniting force. That changed in 1832, when the Democrats had the gall to fuck with the holy of holies for those proto-industrialists: economic policy. Jackson vetoed the renewal of the National Bank's charter, and South Carolina tried to nullify the tariffs that protected northern industry from foreign competition. Almost overnight, the northern proto-industrialists united into a faction that then became the American Whig Party, led by Adams and Clay. Now, you might not get this because you're not 250 years old, but that name was actually a clever little jab at Jackson, framing him as a tyrannical king and the Whigs as the noble, down-to-earth opposition. Despite this, the chief supporters of the Whigs were, of course, the northern proto-industrialists, but this rhetoric also allowed them to appeal to the states' rights Southern planters that Jackson had alienated as he consolidated power. See, Jackson actually vetoed that nullification of tariffs that South Carolina tried to implement, along with many, many other things. That, combined with the open, corrupt the spoils system, really did consolidate a great deal of power into the office of the president, and those Southern planters who wanted the states to be more powerful than the national government somehow convinced themselves that the Whigs were their champions. Goes to show, just because someone is a member of the ruling class doesn't mean they're even vaguely intelligent. Picture definitely not related. The Whigs also gestured vaguely at opposing slavery a little bit, hypothetically, at some point down the line maybe, which helped to court lower class northern voters, many of whom by this point were outright abolitionists. During all this time, a few new tools had dropped into the laps of both the Democrats and the Whigs, those being party newspapers and party loyalty. Thanks to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, newspapers were now becoming widespread, and both parties, especially the Whigs, began to churn out propaganda that supported their political projects. This technology was what allowed the Whigs to paint themselves as the party of the common man, standing up to tyranny, while at the same time advocating for nationalist economic and trade policies. That is, while their actual policies were almost entirely concerned with building and unleashing capitalism in the US, they effectively marketed themselves as opposing the tyranny of Jackson's Democrats. The Democrats, while they did also have papers, relied more heavily on a system of party loyalty, where they imposed on their members the demand that they vote blue no matter who. Up until this point, it had been common for party members to vote against their own party's candidates if they disagreed with them, but no more. Jackson's system of open corruption, the spoils system, materially incentivized rank-and-file Democrats to toe the party line on the off chance that they get a political appointment down the line. These superstructural innovations alone couldn't change the material base, though. Shortly after the election of Democrat Martin Van Buren, the economy took a nosedive in the Panic of 1837, a depression brought on by land speculation, a downturn in cotton prices, now the dominant cash crop in the South, and the fact that Jackson had vetoed the charter renewal of the National Bank. Who could have seen that coming? So, the Whigs got their crack at power in the election of 1840, when their man William Henry Harrison became president for exactly a month before he kicked the bucket. But as it turns out, Harrison's VP Tyler was really more sympathetic to Democratic policies than Whig, and his administration really just continued the same policies that the Democrats before him had, including vetoing the National Bank Charter again. Not only did this 180 policy shift turn the capitalist against him, but the lower class anti-slavery voters were all busy with the new, more radically abolitionist, free soil and barn burner movements, meaning the Whigs were falling apart before they even really got started. During this time, conflicts began to brew with Mexico over the American settlers attempting to steal the state of Tejas from them, and with the British over unsettled boundaries in Oregon. The Whigs, still trying to make their capitalist backers happy by stabilizing the national economy, wanted to avoid war in both cases. The Democrats, on the other hand, needed to keep their southern planter backers and yeoman farmer base happy through continual imperialism, so they were rattling their sabers in both directions. Predictably, the Democrats won the next election with promises of more manifest destiny, and Polk comes into office just in time to settle the border in Oregon, annex Tejas, now mispronounced as Texas, and invade Mexico. TLDR, the US won and annexed literally like half of Mexico, and then it was election time again. With the influx of hundreds of thousands of square miles of new land and the rising tide of the abolition movement, it was now time for the Democrats to be so embroiled in internal contradictions that they completely fall apart. Northern Democrats split from the party, running as the abolitionist Free Soil Party, obviously a highly controversial move for the party that was backed by slave-holding Southern planters. As a result, the Whigs won and got famous General Zachary Taylor in office, and it looked like they'd finally get that national bank charter back. If only Congress could stop talking about the annoying little fringe matter of slavery, that is. Well, until Taylor died, reportedly because he, quote, consumed copious amounts of cherries and iced milk while attending holiday celebrations. 0 for 2, Yankee capitalists. As I implied, most of Taylor's time in office had been spent arguing about whether or not slavery should be allowed in the newly conquered Mexican territories, and/or fighting over the new fugitive slave law. The capitalist hopes dashed once again, but once his VP Millard Fillmore was inaugurated, the poor, oppressed capitalists finally got to implement the policies that were really important. That is, the government started giving them vast piles of cash to build railroads, roads, canals, and other industrial infrastructure. The Whigs were now finally the dominant aspect of the contradiction. If only the filthy common people could recognize that everything was perfect now that they were in charge, instead of focusing on the little trifle that was the expansion of chattel slavery and the implementation of the Fugitive Slave Law. For those who are unfamiliar, in 1850, the same year Fillmore took office, there were two major acts involving slavery. The first was the Compromise of 1850, which allowed for slavery in the new state of Texas and in the District of Washington, D.C., in exchange for the admittance of California as a free state, and the implementation of the Fugitive Slave Law, which made it a national crime for anyone, even in free states, to have either escaped from slavery and/or assisted someone else in their escape from slavery. Remember that can that they'd been kicking down the road for 75 years? Well, it finally landed here in 1850, and this was the last time that they could kick it. After the passage of these two pieces of legislation, the primary contradiction had shifted away from economic policy and was now irrevocably placed on slavery. Abolition had long been popular among lower classes in the North and now in the West, but the Whigs were unable to effectively capitalize on that sentiment because of their coalition partners of states' rights Southern planters. But now, those who supported abolition were liable to be prosecuted and/or imprisoned, meaning they would accept nothing less than the repeal of the Fugitive Slave Act, if not outright abolition. At the same time, the Democrats and the Southern planters that owned them began to see a use in federal economic policy thanks to that very same Fugitive Slave Law, and began to sublate previously Whig positions of national economic policy into their own platforms, mostly, of course, to disincentivize abolitionist sentiment. This two-pronged attack completely dissolved the Whig Party, and the Democrats became the single dominant force in national politics for the next decade. Given the people that paid the Democratic Party, the Southern planters, it shouldn't surprise you what position they took on the slavery issue. After the election of 1852, Democratic administrations of Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan, both northern quote-unquote moderate Democrats, pushed for the strict enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Law and went to bat for the institution of slavery at every opportunity, including allowing slavery to expand into Kansas, contradicting the Missouri Compromise, and intervening in Supreme Court case Dred Scott v. Sanford to ensure that black people did not and could never have US citizenship. At the same time, they continued the policies of imperialism against indigenous people to distribute the land to poor white men, and also continued to shovel money into the pockets of the northern capitalists with lucrative railroad contracts. A new democratic synthesis had been formed. But as with all syntheses, its very creation began to sow the seeds for its own later split. Northerners, the majority of which had been abolitionists for decades at this point, were pissed that they were being legally penalized for not liking literal slavery, and that the federal government was now in the pocket of the very planters that they detested. And Southern planters, now recognizing the use of the federal government in imposing unpopular policies on the country, wished the federal government to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act even harder, to re-enslave every last black person in the country for them. Join me next time to see how these contradictions are finally resolved by average working-class abolitionists and slaves writing a polite Change.org petition to kindly and peacefully ask the Southern planters to stop breeding, owning, abusing, and murdering people because they have a slightly different skin color.
If you're new to this, let me know how I did. Does this make any sense at all, or are you more confused than you were before? If you're old to this, let me know what you think I missed, and leave your reading recommendations in the comments. If you've somehow made it to the end of this monster video and would like to see more communist content, please negate the algorithm's distaste for progressive revolutionary content by liking and subscribing, and maybe tossing a link or two to a bud, preach. Lastly, but most importantly, the views expressed in this video are solely those of the book's author, and do not necessarily reflect the views of the video creator. It has been made solely for educational and entertainment purposes, and the creator does not make any representation or warranties with respect to the accuracy, applicability, fitness, or completeness of the content within. Please don't hurt me.